Tonight, we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had monitored, analyzed, and prepared for. Okay, a move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in mere hours. Hours that shifted the strategic balance in Eastern Europe, hours that forced emergency meetings across NATO capitals. Hours that left Moscow scrambling to respond to a reality they did not anticipate. What NATO did this week crossed a threshold that the Kremlin had hoped would hold indefinitely. And when that threshold was crossed, Russia did not have a clear answer. They responded with confusion, with contradictory statements, and with what analysts are now describing as visible uncertainty at the highest levels of power. Okay? For those of you watching this channel, we focus on breaking down complex geopolitical developments into understandable analysis. Yeah, tonight is no different. We are going to examine exactly what happened, why it matters, and what it signals about the evolving dynamics between NATO and Russia in this critical period. Okay, so let us begin. For several months now, there had been signals, not official declarations, not formal announcements, just signals that NATO was preparing something significant. NATO has been cautious, yes, but they have been deliberate in their caution. Their moves have followed a certain pattern, a rhythm, almost a predictability. Okay. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor NATO activity know the indicators well. The frequency of military exercises, the movement of strategic assets, the diplomatic communications between member states, the sudden changes in defense posture, all of that went quiet. And whenever NATO goes quiet, it typically means something significant is being coordinated behind closed doors. This is not speculation. This is how major alliances operate when they are preparing unified action. They reduce external signals to minimize the opportunity for adversaries to prepare counter-response. Moscow, according to multiple reports from European intelligence sources, noticed this silence, and they grew concerned. Because in the world of geopolitical strategy, silence from a major alliance is rarely a sign of inaction. It is almost always a sign of coordinated preparation. Early this week, Russian monitoring systems detected what analysts described as unprecedented NATO coordination, including military positioning that had not been observed in over 3 decades. These are the kinds of strategic moves that NATO only implements when they are signaling something very specific, enhanced deterrence, expanded defensive capability, or a fundamental shift in alliance posture. Russian analysts did not know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all 3 at once. But what they did know was that NATO was changing its strategic approach. And when a military alliance of this magnitude shifts posture without public explanation, even by small measures, every major power pays attention. What made this particular development so significant was the scope. According to reports from multiple defense publications, this was not limited to one region or one member state. This was alliance-wide coordination, multiple member nations moving in synchronization, multiple asset categories being repositioned simultaneously. This level of coordination requires extensive planning, significant resources, and most importantly, unanimous agreement among member states. And that unanimity is what appears to have caught Moscow off guard. The assumption in Russian strategic circles, according to analysts who study Kremlin thinking, was that NATO would remain divided on key issues. That assumption, as of this week, appears to have been incorrect. The statement issued by NATO leadership this week was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was direct. Official after briefing described Russia's recent activities as destabilizing, inconsistent with international norms, and perhaps most importantly, requiring a unified alliance response, but strategic messaging only works if the target believes it will be followed by action. And Russia, based on their public statements, appears to have underestimated NATO's willingness to act. In fact, the alliance response this week was among the most coordinated we have seen in the post-Cold War era. Here is what we know based on publicly available information. Within 48 hours of the initial coordination being detected, NATO member states began implementing what defense analysts are calling enhanced forward presence measures. These were not the routine rotational deployments we have seen in previous years. These were accelerated positioning of strategic assets, systems, and capabilities that NATO only deploys when they are preparing to demonstrate the serious deterrent capability. This distinction matters. Routine deployment signal business, us, accelerated strategic positioning signals that an alliance is preparing for potential escalation and wants adversaries to understand that preparation is underway. This week, defense officials confirmed that NATO accelerated implementation of defensive measures across multiple member states, including enhanced air defense systems that had recently been upgraded for what analysts believe was exactly this kind of scenario. NATO moved before Russia could establish counter positions. They reinforced eastern flank territories. They enhanced intelligence sharing protocols. They activated rapid response elements that were specifically designed for moments of heightened uncertainty. In other words, NATO targeted the strategic ambiguity that Russia has relied upon. The uncertainty that would have made escalation more tempting, this is what made NATO's coordination so significant. Russia's recent moves were not just rhetorical, they were designed to test alliance cohesion. They represented the kind of probing that could exploit divisions if left unanswered. And NATO, understanding that dynamic fully, responded with unity, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They did not escalate beyond defensive measures. They did not engage in provocative rhetoric. They reinforced deterrence through capability. They demonstrated cohesion through coordinated action. This is the textbook response to strategic probing. You do not match aggression with aggression. You match uncertainty with clarity. You show the adversary that their attempt to exploit divisions has failed. And based on Moscow's subsequent statements, that message appears to have been received. And here is where the story becomes even more significant. Western analysts now believe that Russia's latest moves were designed to test the resolve of NATO after months of political transitions and domestic challenges across member states. And Moscow wanted to see whether NATO would fragment, delay, or issue only symbolic responses. But instead, the opposite happened. NATO did not fragment. They coordinated a response that was so unified, so rapid, that even Russian state media took notice. You do not get the Kremlin's attention easily. But this week, NATO did. Defense analysts, speaking with international media under standard conditions, described Russia's subsequent shift as recalibration, a way to adjust expectations after an unexpected outcome. But NATO proved this week that they remain both capable and unified. Their defensive measures were not only substantial, they were implemented so precisely that multiple independent analysts noted the coordination. That coordination matters because it shows something important. It shows that NATO is not merely a symbolic alliance. They are an operational alliance, one that can move from deliberation to implementation faster than adversaries anticipated. And this has significant implications for how Russia will calculate future moves. If they believed NATO was divided and slow, this week demonstrated otherwise. And strategic calculations are only as good as the assumptions underlying them. Okay. When those assumptions prove incorrect, strategies must be reconsidered. That reconsideration appears to be underway in Moscow right now. Okay. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of NATO's coordinated response. First, Eastern European member states activated enhanced monitoring protocols, ensuring comprehensive awareness of any further Russian movements. Second, Western European members accelerated previously planned defensive upgrades that had been scheduled for later implementation. Third, North American members operating through established alliance frameworks reportedly enhanced intelligence sharing mechanisms used to maintain real-time situational awareness. This was not just diplomatic signaling, this was not just political messaging, this was operational coordination, this was strategic implementation. And strategic implementation is the one thing Russia has struggled to counter since the alliance demonstrated its ability to act in unison. For every attempt Moscow has made to exploit perceived divisions, NATO has countered with something that reinforces cohesion. This pattern is important to understand. Russia's strategic approach has relied significantly on the assumption that Western alliances will eventually fracture under pressure. Every time that assumption is tested and proven wrong, it weakens the foundation of that strategic approach. This week was another such test, and once again, NATO passed. Remember, Moscow thought that political transitions across NATO member states would create exploitable divisions. And they thought that economic pressures would reduce alliance willingness to invest in defense. They thought that domestic challenges would distract member states from external coordination, but this week, the exact opposite became evident. Political transitions have not weakened alliance commitment. MDO, economic pressures have not reduced defense investment. Domestic challenges have not prevented external coordination. This matters because it fundamentally challenges assumptions that have guided Russian strategy for years. And when your strategic assumptions prove consistently incorrect, you face a choice. You either adjust your assumptions and develop new strategies, or you continue with approaches that have repeatedly failed. The coming months will reveal which path Moscow chooses. But this week provided significant data points suggesting their current assumptions are not aligned with reality. But what makes this moment so significant and so consequential is that Russia's latest moves happened at a time when leadership in Moscow is under substantial domestic pressure. And economic reformers want reduced international tensions to enable growth. Security hardliners want demonstrations of strength regardless of consequences. And regional officials want resources directed toward domestic needs. Military leadership wants continued support for strategic priorities. Russian leadership is balancing these demands while managing an international situation that has not developed as anticipated. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they are not always doing it from strength. They are sometimes doing it from pressure. They are sometimes doing it from a need to demonstrate action when strategic options are limited. This does not excuse concerning behavior, but it does help explain the context. Understanding why actors behave as they do is essential for predicting what they might do next. And predicting future behavior is essential for preparing appropriate responses. This is why analysis matters, not to justify concerning actions, but to understand them well enough to counter them effectively. NATO's official statement, now widely distributed through international media, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to accept gradual erosion of security architecture. Manned officials said plainly that Russia's recent activities were inconsistent with stated commitments to stability. Omdats, that is diplomatic language for a clear message. We see what you are doing. We are not going to ignore it. And we are prepared to respond. You do not usually hear that tone from NATO leadership unless something serious is at stake. The alliance historically prefers measured, ambiguous language that preserves diplomatic flexibility. When they shift to direct, unambiguous messaging, it signals that internal deliberations have concluded and unified positions have been established. But that shift happened this week, and it did not go unnoticed in Moscow. And Russian state media, which typically dismisses Western statements as irrelevant, devoted substantial coverage to analyzing NATO's messaging. That coverage itself reveals something important. When you spend significant resources analyzing something, you consider it significant. Moscow considers this week's NATO coordination significant, and that recognition may influence their subsequent calculations. Meanwhile, multiple NATO member state leaders addressed their respective populations in serious and substantive remarks this week. They emphasized commitment to collective defense. They emphasized the importance of alliance unity, and they emphasized that defensive preparation is not provocation, but rather responsible governance. These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from governments that understand just how high the stakes have become. When leaders across multiple nations deliver similar messages within short time frames, it reflects coordination. And that coordination sends its own signal. It tells adversaries that attempts to divide the alliance through selective pressure will not succeed. It tells domestic populations that their governments are taking security seriously. And it tells international observers that the alliance remains functional and unified. All three of those signals matter, and all three were delivered this week. Here is what makes the situation even more concerning for long-term stability. Russia's latest moves were not isolated. Along with their primary activities, diplomatic pressure increased on multiple fronts simultaneously. Economic leverage was applied through various mechanisms. Information operations intensified, targeting multiple populations. All of this happened within the same time frame. When major powers move multiple pieces simultaneously, it typically means something larger is underway. It means coordinated strategy rather than isolated tactics. It means long-term planning rather than reactive behavior. Understanding this coordination is essential for developing appropriate responses. You cannot counter coordinated strategy with isolated reactions. You need coordinated counter strategy, and that is precisely what NATO demonstrated this week. Coordinated response to coordinated pressure. Unity matching attempts to create division. This is how alliances maintain relevance, not through statements alone. Through demonstrated capability and coordinated action, analysts are now considering several possibilities for what comes next. One is that Moscow is preparing for extended strategic competition and positioning accordingly. Another is that Moscow is attempting to establish new baselines for acceptable behavior through gradual pressure. Thus, a third possibility, the one concerning officials the most, is that Moscow is attempting to create conditions where adversaries become accustomed to concerning behavior, reducing responses over time. But this week, NATO took that approach off the table. They did not normalize concerning behavior. They did not minimize the significance of recent moves. They did not delay response pending further analysis. They responded with coordinated defensive action. This matters because it establishes precedent. When concerning behavior receives swift, unified response, it discourages repetition. When concerning behavior receives delayed, divided response, it encourages escalation. And NATO chose the first option this week, and that choice will influence Russian calculations going forward. What we are watching now is a test of alliance resilience. Moscow wants to see whether NATO will maintain unity under sustained pressure. But NATO wants to demonstrate that unity is not just rhetorical, but operational. Blends, European members want to prevent security deterioration on their borders. And North American members want to prevent challenges to the international order they helped establish. And all of these objectives are now being tested simultaneously. The outcome will shape international relations for years to come. This is why this week matters beyond immediate events. It is a data point in a longer competition, and a demonstration that will be analyzed and remembered, and a precedent that will influence future behavior on all sides. Tonight, we continue receiving reports from analysts who are monitoring Russian responses closely. They say Moscow's public messaging has shifted noticeably since NATO's coordination became apparent. Manja. They say internal discussions are reportedly focused on reassessing alliance capabilities. And they say Russia's decision to escalate pressure is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western resolve during a period of perceived transition. But NATO is not responding with uncertainty. In fact, NATO is responding with clarity. And their response this week, swift, unified, and substantive, sent a message to Moscow that miscalculation has consequences. And it sent a message to alliance members that collective defense remains operationally meaningful. Both of those messages matter. The first influences adversary calculations. The second reinforces alliance cohesion. Together, they strengthen deterrence. And strengthened deterrence reduces the likelihood of miscalculation. That is the purpose of this week's response. Not aggression, deterrence. And not escalation, stability. Understanding this distinction is essential for understanding the current moment. As the situation develops, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Moscow hoped to achieve with their recent activities. But what we do know is that NATO's response was timely. It prevented potential miscalculation based on assumptions of alliance division. It demonstrated operational capability that reinforces deterrent credibility. And it established precedent that concerning behavior will receive swift, coordinated response. What happens next will depend on what Moscow does in the coming weeks. Commenges. If they choose de-escalation, this moment will be remembered as successful deterrence in action. If they choose continued pressure, NATO has already demonstrated they are prepared to maintain unified response. They have shown they are capable of coordination. They have shown they are willing to act. They have shown they are ready to respond to whatever comes next. This is what effective alliance management looks like. Not perfect, not without internal disagreements, but ultimately unified when unity matters most. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be reconsidering assumptions. The Kremlin's public messaging is notably different from recent patterns, more measured, more ambiguous. And when Moscow becomes ambiguous, it typically means they are reassessing. It means they are evaluating outcomes against expectations. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because this week, Moscow learned something significant. NATO remains unified despite pressure. NATO remains capable despite challenges. And NATO remains willing to respond despite costs. This story is far from over. Strategic competition between major powers does not conclude quickly. Man, but tonight, one thing is clear, assumptions of alliance division have been challenged. Expectations of slow response have been disproven, and calculations based on Western weakness require revision. We will continue monitoring this situation closely. Bibidia, we will continue providing analysis as developments emerge, and we will continue breaking down complex geopolitical dynamics into understandable commentary. That is what this channel is about, not sensationalism, analysis, not fear, understanding. Thank you for watching. Jan, thank you for engaging with substantive content. And thank you for being part of a community that values informed discussion over superficial takes. Drem. The next phase of this story will unfold in the coming days and weeks. And we will be here analyzing every detail as events develop. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we will see you in the next analysis.